Hi, Pastor Jim here today with another word just to encourage you as we look at some other verses from the Psalms and some really neat things. I know that many of you have family histories and family stories, and I know our family does, and so many times we're talking, and suddenly somebody will say, "Do you remember when?" Or do you remember that time? The idea of remembrance, remembering what is going on. And why do we do that? Well, there may be a lot of reasons why. Part of the time, it's just fun to remember some of those things. For us and our family history, there's a lot of really funny and exciting stories. Sometimes it's done because it just helps us connect with our family history. Sometimes I think we do it because it helps us remember what our path, what our journey has been as a family or as a person. And so thinking about that, remembering, that made me keep in mind especially Psalm 145, because there David writes just a great hymn of praise to God, to remember who He is, and so I want to look at that just for a minute, minute, to remember who God is. You see, that's so important in our life. David knew that. And David writes all of Psalm 145, and he says, "Remember who God is." He starts out in verse 3, "Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. His greatness no one can fathom." Great is the Lord. He goes on to say, when they speak of your mighty splendor and your majesty, I will meditate on your wonderful works. He's just saying, remember the greatness of God. Remember his mighty acts. I don't know what David had in mind here, but as you read through the scriptures, you can think of a lot of things that God did. Some really mighty things. I mean, everything from creation uh, to remember the time when he opened the Red Sea and allowed all his people to go through the incredible acts or wonderful works that he has done. And again, we don't know what he was talking about, what he had in mind. It could be that he's remembering the wonderful works when God provided manna for his people in the wilderness, or maybe just providing them a land to go to. He says, remember the greatness of who God is. Not only that, remember, he goes on to say, his graciousness and compassionate heart. Verse 5 said, "The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all he has made." He says, remember this about God, that he is gracious, he is compassionate. He puts it this way, he's slow to anger. So many people somehow have a vision of that God as this, like he's an angry person up there with a thumb ready to squash us down, and God is nothing like that. uh, I think that sometimes we wish God would act more quickly, but he doesn't, and oftentimes it's because he has great compassion. He wants people to come to know him. He says he is good to all. He is compassionate to all who trust him, who follow him. And so he says, remember the greatness. Remember him that he's great. Remember that he's full of compassion, that he's gracious. And he says in both of these, he says, tell it. Tell it to others. Continue to tell it. Remember who God is. You could start out, remember when God did. That's the idea here. He goes on to say, remember that God is faithful. He's faithful, and he says, especially to his promises. All his promises are going to happen. God is faithful to them. Now, he is loving, he says, to all who that he has made. He upholds them, he says. He lifts them up. He provides for them. The promises of God are absolutely incredible. And he says, remember those because God is faithful. Remember, he says, that he is righteous. The Lord is righteous in all his ways. He is absolute righteousness. There is no sin. He is absolutely holy. And he loves those who are his. Those are just some of the things that David writes about here. He says, remember these things about who God is. Remember them. So, what's the value of this? Why is David telling us that we need to remember? Well, he says one thing here in Psalm 145 that is so interesting. Verse 18, after all these things, he's reminded. He says this: The Lord is near to all who call on him, to all who call on him in truth. And I looked at that verse and I thought, what a great remembrance that is as we remember who Christ is. You see, as we remember who God is, as we remember him, it brings us to a place where we remember that he is near us. It's like the verse in Philippians, where again he says, The Lord is near. David wants us to remember the Lord is near. This one who is great, this one who is compassionate, this one who is faithful, this one who is righteous is near to us. Isn't that great? And as I remember who God is, it helps me be willing to come to him. He goes on to say here that the Lord is near. Those who call on him can call on him in truth. And he says this: he hears their cries and saves them. That doesn't mean everything is absolutely perfect how we want, but it does mean that God delivers in his way, in his time. I mean, God is really for you. He says he watches over those who love him. Since I remember these things about God, it draws my heart to him. I know that he's near. I know that I can talk to him. I know that he watches over me, and therefore I can open my heart to him. I can trust him. David knew what he was talking about, didn't he? To remember God is a great thing because it opens up our heart to remember that we can trust him. This is another great way, isn't it, to experience hope over fear. Remember God and know that he is near.